Alright, today in this video response for the course, I'm going to be talking about the article on creating a third space in the classroom environment, partially because I think in a bit of a sense I almost did that in our class here, reading and writing across the curriculum, by bringing up the idea of why aren't we engaging third spaces in the post-secondary community just based on the idea of the multimodality situation. We don't really value the videos, or at least that's what I've been suggesting at the time when I posted my first one. But the third space article brings up a lot of different ideas, some of which almost seemed as if they were surprising that we hadn't considered them before, and others that honestly are very much a situational sort of environmental thing that are going to be dependent on the students you're going to be engaging in the classroom. I just want to start with a quote here that's from page 42 of the article. Hybridity theory posits that people in any given community draw multiple resources or funds to make sense of the world. And this is something that I hadn't really considered was neglected in the educational scenario as much as the article indicates that it is. From the time I kind of entered the teaching community, one idea that had been always recommended to me, always suggested, was consider what your students know. What fonts of knowledge do they happen to bring? And how can you bring that into the classroom? This article really brought to light some of the scenarios that are going to occur with the communities that are honestly the minorities when it comes to the curriculum environment, especially with regards to the students who aren't from the dominant culture that the curriculum is designed and based for. Because it's right, the article does mention how the discourses within not only the genres and topics in the curriculum, but in the discourses in academic texts themselves are privileged, and they're accorded the ways of knowing that almost make them intrusive to the same idea as the colonizer in the sort of post-colonial view that the article does mention at the early beginning times. But it does make it clear that this is something that needs to be considered. It's something that seems blatantly obvious in retrospect after reading the article, but it's something that we do need to consider because of the different cultures that are going to be surrounding things. If you take a look at the article and the fonts of knowledge that these students had, but weren't necessarily considered as valued in the classroom, it makes you really want to extend your hand out and engage them. Take a look at Vivanya and her mother, for example, with the scenario, two different scenarios. One in which she was discussing archaeology, which is highly connected to the topic of science in the way you explore things, you make your observations, you document what you found, but she didn't see the connection there. For her, it was a connection to social studies. It was something else entirely, and even then, it wasn't something that was all that highly discussed as a method of discovery, so much as in that was just something that social studies did. The people who engage in social studies, they explore things, they dig things up, they look for information. And the other one is the scenario in which her mother told her to examine the erosion of a rock, in particular on the river during her vacation. And both of the scenarios really struck me as interesting due to the fact that these are students who don't believe, this is a student who doesn't believe that this information is valued in the science classroom because it's never been mentioned before, it's never been integrated into that classroom environment. The observation and detailed analysis of the natural world that is coming up when you study something like water erosion on a rock is something that is going to be a natural part and an involved part in the terms of the science community. But we're not explicitly bringing this to light. It's something that third space, the acknowledgement needs to be more so not that we need to recognize that students have other fonts of knowledge, but explicitly acknowledging it in the classroom environment. Because no student comes into a classroom as an empty slate. No student is able to function in a classroom environment without having some background knowledge. We're always talking about connecting background knowledge. What does a student know, and how can we bring what they know here to our topic at hand down here and connect them together? We're talking about that all the time when we're thinking about studying different subjects. What about in the history section when we were talking about the explicit genre instruction, how we can connect what they know with history or what different ideas that they happen to have and bring the two together so that they can understand the topics. And in a sense, that's what this third space article is doing. It's expressing different ideas of how we need to make sure that we bring those connections explicitly to light, because they're not necessarily going to be as valued. And the interesting thing is, it's not that researchers and such don't acknowledge it, it's the fact that the students themselves don't seem to realize that what they happen to know outside the classroom environment has bearing in the classroom scenario. So to me, it feels as if the article is trying to suggest that we need to make this known to students. There's a lot of different fronts of knowledge that they can draw from. And in fact, by bringing in members of these communities, or such as guest speakers perhaps for different scenarios or different things, it may be very useful. For example, if we take a look at the section wherein they're discussing, which one was it here? The water purity, the water quality. It was something that they knew quite a bit about, especially with regards to the mescal farming. And the student whose father was a professional landscaper around the city. Both of them have different fronts of knowledge that are directly connected into the science particular topic. We need to be considering ways that can connect. It's not just that their parents know about these things, talk about them, but they're honestly, in a sense, real-world examples of experts. And that should be something that you can embrace to sort of bridge the gap. You can do things like call on the parents themselves to come in and talk about these things and how they relate to their job. That is a real-world connection that engages them in this third space. It's not just something that we need to consider, it's something that we actively need to go out and create. And it's more than just a resource here. It's more than just something that you have to do. It's something that's going to happen whether or not you intend to engage it. Okay, let me rephrase that. It's not going to happen if you don't allow it to. But if you engender an environment that values different information, this third space can come into being and create an environment where they can expand on their own reflected experiences, which will give them a deeper background understanding in the topics themselves. And that's something that I think the article is really trying to address here, is that this third space is nothing more than finding a way to value what the students already know and connect it into the curriculum-centric experiences. It's fonts of background knowledge, in a sense. What do they know? What do they value, and how can that become something that you can bring to the classroom? Now, admittedly, this isn't something that's going to be necessarily easy for any teacher to do, especially if you're not someone who is in touch with that particular culture or scenario. For example, with regards to the magazines, a lot of the students focused on certain trends that are within the Latino community popular and something that they're invested in, such as the Lowrider magazine. That's a magazine with a very particular font of knowledge in cars specifically that are designed and created, or modified I should say, to have them designed to certain specifications and certain styles. It's an aesthetic appeal, a mechanical appeal, and also a technical aspect of how do you do these modifications themselves. It's a unique section of knowledge that the science curriculum that the article talks about should be able to engage, but the steps need to be made in the first place. The other problem, at least with regards to language, can be where the students actually get the knowledge from. If you are unfamiliar with the language itself, that can cause some barriers, because talking about something in a Spanish setting can provide a bit of a different view than in what we consider the more mainstream Anglo-centric news that we end up talking about. But both are something that we need to figure out a way to connect. In truth, I think the biggest thing we need to consider with regards to the third space is, how can we avoid ignoring this? It is a concept that the article honestly demonstrates is out there. The family is a scenario in which these students are able to bring all sorts of ideas from, as I mentioned with Vanya's family and the Stone, or the Lowrider magazine, and the car clubs that these students are engaged with. The peer groups, the community, the popular culture, none of this is isolated. It's all something that the students are already going to be engaged in. And what we need to consider is the challenge here of, how do you build a curriculum experience that can allow these students to draw on their many fonts of knowledge, the many different ways in which they've constructed their knowledge and an identity outside of the classroom, and how do you bring it into the classroom, into the area where they usually don't believe that this sort of idea is not valued. Instead, it's a very specific and sometimes somewhat foreign language of, this is how it is in terms of science or history. It goes back to some of the other stuff we've discussed over the course here, in the way we want to engender students to look at how do these practices actually occur. Too often it's a straightforward, cut and dry, this is the right answer, this is how you do it, this is what we're looking at, this is the data on the timeline in history, when we're not showing them the practices of it, which would allow them to possibly pull some of their outside information, their own fonts of knowledge, into this third space that you can create. It seems as if this entire class has been building up towards this idea, towards this concept. We need to figure out a way to teach students how to participate in the actual acts of, or practices of, the historical community, the scientific community, the mathematical community, outside of, here's the function, here's the point in the timeline, here's how the water cycle works, but instead the concepts of investigation, discussion, and debate that are engendered around all these ideas, from the historical discussion to the science. This third space is a way to bridge it. And students are able to actively create a third space in their own way in the classroom environment, if you let them. It suggests that there may not be quite as large gap between the content area learning and everyday experiences, as long as you allow them to be recognized as such. And I believe that this article is a good demonstrator of that fact. If you look at what we've discussed throughout this course, it's all about being able to find ways to let the student engage in the text, engage in the knowledge, and use what they already know in these scenarios. And if you can create a third space like this, bring the outside school into the academic environment of the school community, you can create that third space and further the fonts of knowledge, further their background understanding and information that they have on hand to be able to understand and recognize what they're learning, which in turn will just only assist them more. This is something we should be striving for, and I'm starting to think that it needs more recognition, such as students have trouble searching on the internet, and yet how can they find all this detailed information about topics of their understanding or that they value? We need to be able to bring that to the classroom. I think a third space is exactly how we can engender or strive to do this.